want to welcome you again officially here, and just say, my name is Rob. I'm the pastor at the Evangelical Free Church on 8th Street. So we're on the North Shore. We got to hear Paul Chamberlain today too, via your feed. So thank you guys for sharing Paul with us this morning via video. And I heard Paul about 10 years ago for the first time in Surrey at a church there, and I didn't realize I could listen so fast. Right? My boy, he's 16, and we were talking a little bit about the message, and he goes, you know what? I really liked it that he talked fast. Teachers, they get mad at me. They keep telling me, you need to slow down when you talk. I like it when he talks fast. And he goes, there's only so much time. So Paul will make the most of that. And how many of you were here this morning in this building? Get to hear that, and just welcome back. Thanks for investing. And how many were down the hill on the North Shore via video feed? Okay, so quite a few, good. And we're just looking forward again to Paul continuing his talk. And if you know anyone who has questions regarding your faith, if you've been at any place where you've wondered, what do I say, how do I respond, it's really good to be able to interact and hear from someone who's had many conversations with individuals. And so it's good for us. You know, thanks so much for coming on up and sharing with us, not just this morning, but tonight and tomorrow as well.
Okay.
So thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob. It's a real pleasure. Good to see you. And it's really great to have all you folks back here tonight. I really commend you, and I really think it's just terrific that the two churches are working together. And it seems to me there's actually more than two churches here. At least I see Valen Straley down here, who I haven't seen for quite a while, and I know he's not from either one of those churches. But it's really great to see you here, Valen. At least I didn't think you were. Have I got something wrong there, Valen? You go to two churches. Okay. I guess maybe I did see you raise your hand a second ago when you asked how many people were at the free, and I couldn't figure that out. Okay, so you were there. I'm just curious, how many people here are from neither the E-Free Church or this church? There are a handful like that? Yes, I see a few like that too. So I'm really glad that you folks are here as well. This is really great, and I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be getting through tonight. I just want to commend you all for setting aside time for something as important as putting effort into this task of learning how we can respond to secular perspectives on our faith. It's great for us. It's great for the people we get to chat with, to talk to. It gives us a chance to serve God, serve others more effectively. It's really exciting. There just seem to me to be no downsides to it. And it's a really enjoyable process going through it as well. Let me just tell you a little bit about my own background here. I mentioned some of this morning in the little group between the two services, so not too many of you were there. But probably like some of you, I was raised in a really great Christian home. I had a mother and dad who both loved God very much, loved each other. I had 4 brothers, 2 sisters. My parents are both gone. All the siblings are still here. We're doing different things all over North America, really, and other countries too, for that matter. And we're all doing very different things as well. But it was a very happy home, and we had a lot of fun together. My dad liked going on vacations, liked doing lots of ice cream treats, boat rides, fishing, hunting, all those car rides in the afternoons, all those kinds of things we did. We had lots of different fun things we could do. And it was really quite a good home. It was a great home to be raised in. When I got to be about 19 or 20, and I had a very positive impression of Christian faith as well. I got to be 19 or 20 years old, somewhere in there, however, I began to develop some questions. And I'm not sure if that's happened to some of you here or not. But the questions I had really nagged at me. And they weren't little ones. They were things like, how do I know this whole thing is real? Wonder if anybody's here has ever asked that. How do I know there's a God up there? How do I know the Bible's true? I mean, we're reading it as though it's a sacred book, this Word of God, but how do I know it's true? How do I know that Jesus is who he says he is? All these things that we believe as Christians, how do I know any of this stuff's true? And I would go on, and I'd go week after week with this thing, and I'd wonder what to do about this, and I thought, well, maybe I could pray and ask God if it's true, but then, of course, that assumes there is a God. That's the very thing I was wondering about. What about reading the Bible? Well, there again, I guess I could read the Bible, but that's the very thing I was wondering about as well. Wasn't sure what to do with it all. Finally, I went to see a very well-respected man in our town. And I gave him a phone call and said, I've got these questions. I wonder if I could come talk to you about it. So I thought, I've got to get something done. I realized I couldn't go on and on. Something was going to have to give. So I sat down with this man in his office, and I laid this stuff out to him. It took me just a few minutes. He listened really well. I got all done. He said, Paul, I'm going to tell you what you got to do. Well, this is going to be great because I need help on this. Finally, someone who knows what I had to do. He says, I want you to get down on your knees and ask God to take those doubts away. And don't get up from that chair till those doubts are gone, he said, with a great big smile on his face. I thought, that is not anything at all like I was expecting to hear. And to tell you the truth, it wasn't really very helpful to me at that moment either. Not because the advice is really completely bad, but you see, I had already done that kind of thing. And I walked away later on thinking, boy, I guess that wasn't, I was expecting something different. I wasn't sure what to make of that. Later on, as I've thought back, I'm thinking, if I had followed that advice to a T, I may still be at that chair. Oh, in Alberta. There's still maybe a corpse in the kneeling position at that chair in Alberta. It's still there waiting for something good to happen because I'd already tried all that. It wasn't until later on I enrolled in a Christian college, and they had a course there called Foundations of Christianity. I didn't even have a clue what that meant, but it was a required course, so I was signed up. And I remember being in the cafeteria line, walking through the line, looking at my course list, and I said to the guy beside me, what's this Foundations of Christianity? What's that? He said, well, that's a course in apologetics. I'd heard about apologetics. I said, oh, okay, so we take that. Once I got in there, I immediately began running and began reading people like Paul Little. You remember that name? He wrote a book called Know Why You Believe. Really helpful little book to me at the time. Josh McDowell, C.S. Lewis, John Warwick Montgomery, even Ravi Zacharias and William Lane Craig and people like that. People who were asking, just the fact that they were asking the questions I was asking and actually giving some good answers to some of them as well. Immediately had things begin to change in my mind. I began to realize, there are answers to some of these questions. I mean, you don't have to kiss your brains goodbye to keep on being a Christian. You can actually think about your faith and think about these questions. And I remember after a few months of that, a switch began happening in my mind where I used to wonder. I used to think, I've got these questions. I don't know if there's answers. Then I began saying, you know what? I do have some more questions, but I have some over here and I got answers to them, so I bet there's answers to these ones over here. When you start thinking that way, the whole thing is a switch, and that was a really wonderful thing for me. And as I went through that, I began thinking, this is all about our Christian faith, isn't it? It's what faith is all about. And it just reminded me, as I've thought about this over the years, of the young boy who was asked. And maybe some of you have had young children. You've asked these kinds of questions too. A group of young boys, I heard about this, young children. They were asked this question by their teacher. What is faith? Ask the children, what's faith? I don't know if you've ever asked a group of kids what faith is. And well, these little kids sat there and no one had any idea what to say. Finally, one little guy put up his hand and said, I'll tell you what faith is. Teacher said, what is it, Billy? He said, faith is believing something you know is not true. Okay? Perfect. Okay. He had it down pat, didn't he? Well, you know what? As I'm actually thinking, once in a while, the things I hear us as adults say about faith makes me wonder if really deep down, that's kind of what we think about it as well. Even though we wouldn't say it that way, but I still sometimes wonder about that. We need to think about our faith and recognize there is such a thing as reasonable faith, informed faith, faith and reason working together. And I find that to be the most exciting kind of faith, the kind of faith that I think is recommended to us in the Bible, the kind of faith that Christianity calls us for us to have. And that's what we're all about here this evening as well. Well, let me just show you a little bit of what we're going to be doing today. The question we're looking at here is, how do Christians view Christianity? And not just that, but what are some of their perspectives on it? What are some of their objections? Maybe you know some of these already. I'm sure we all in this room have some idea what some of those are. We know non-Christian friends. We know some of their perspectives on the faith. We know what our friends and neighbors and even family members are saying. That's what is of interest to me. Why do people who stand outside the Christian community look at something that seems this awesome to us and say, I don't want to have any part of it. I don't believe it. I don't accept it. That maybe is okay for you, but not for me. And yet we're saying this is the greatest thing in the world. This is the greatest message in the world. This is awesome. And yet they're on the outside saying, no, that's okay for you, but it's not for me. Why is that? What are their perspectives and what are their objections to it? And there are some serious ones. And that's where we're going to be going here in the next little bit here. I think it's interesting for us to take a bit of time, and not very long, but talk a little bit about some scriptural insights on what we're doing here today. Let me just throw a couple of scriptures out here on the screen for us to think about. Look at this one here, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. This is what I often call the apologist's favorite verse, okay? Christian apologists always quote this verse. So look what it says. Always be prepared to give an answer or a reason. That word, by the way, is apologia. We mentioned this morning in the sermon. You probably remember that. To everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have, So just so we don't repeat a whole bunch from what we said this morning, let me just say this. And when I see a verse like this, I see Peter saying, you know, we need constant preparedness. We need to be in a constant state of readiness to be able to answer that why question. Why are you a Christian? And as we said this morning, we believe some pretty unusual ideas, don't we? And that's what we're calling upon the world to accept when we communicate the Christian gospel to them. If someone comes up and says, you know, can you give me at least some reason for thinking some of that's true? If all we have to say is, well, you just got to believe it, my friend. You just got to believe it. Well, even Peter says, can't we do better than that? Can't we give some reason? And then there's this other passage we mentioned this morning as well, which I think is worth putting up here. Acts chapter 1, verse 3. Look what Jesus did. He gave his disciples many convincing proofs that he was alive. So even he gave his disciples that kind of information when he sent them out. It seems to me this is a fair question, the kind of question we ourselves would ask if someone presented us something that was that unusual, that different from what we're called upon to believe. So I would just commend those two verses to us to think about. Acts chapter 1, verse 3, and 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. But listen, let me go on to another couple of verses together, and I'll put them up to this way. The two passages together, the passage in Acts 13 and a passage in Acts 17. And when we take these two together, here's a principle I want to commend to you that I see the Apostle Paul and others in the book of Acts living out as well. And that is this, that our approach in communicating and defending the Christian message must be what I would call audience-driven. You see what I'm saying by that? What do I mean audience-driven? Anybody tell me what I mean by that? What does it mean for something to be audience-driven? That's kind of right. The approach comes from looking at the audience. They're the ones ultimately who are going to make the decision on how we go about this. I think that's really well put. Because in Acts 13, if you recall from reading that passage, here is Paul speaking to the Jews, to a group of Jewish people. Acts 17, he's speaking to a group of Gentile people. And tell me this. Do you think his approach was exactly the same speaking to the Jewish people as it was speaking to the Gentile people? Well, if you've read the book of Acts, you'll know right off. And you know what? It makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, think about this. Maybe some of you who are in sales or marketing. Suppose you are, and someone gave you a phone call and said, hey, look, we'd like you to come and make 3 different presentations for us. We've got a little bit of a circuit set up for you to present your product to us. We're doing this with different products around town. The first one in the morning is in the local high school assembly. At lunchtime, we'd like you to stop by the local Chamber of Commerce meeting. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, to stop by the nursing home and give a presentation to those folks. So look what you got. You got the high school assembly, Chamber of Commerce, the nursing home. You're presenting your product at all 3 of those. Are you going to be making the exact same presentation in all 3 of those places? No, you're not, are you? Even though you got the same product, you want to get across the same message. Well, there's nothing really profound and mysterious about this either, and neither did Paul. Paul didn't make the same thing either. So in Acts 13, maybe some of you will recall this, but when he spoke to the Jewish folks, he gave them reasons to believe Jesus was the Messiah, and he gave them from a book which was relevant to them, from a book they trusted, namely, what? The Old Testament. That's what he worked with. So he quoted from the Old Testament where God had promised to send a Holy One, a Messiah, and remember what it said there? Whose body would not see decay. Now this is interesting, isn't it? Because if there's one thing we know for sure, it is that when you die, your body decays. That's what will happen. It'll happen very soon. And yet, here's Paul, and he's using the same argument. He says, look back to what is said in the Old Testament. We are all waiting for this one who's going to come, and that's one thing we know about him. His body will not see decay. And then what did Paul do? He pointed to Jesus, who had died and risen again 3 days later before his body could decay. Now, I would just say this to you about that argument. This is, and Paul's point was, could this not be the one who was promised? I mean, look at the evidence. This kind of thing doesn't happen and have happened in this one time. And here's what I think we should say here, that if you were a Jew with that kind of knowledge and that kind of history and that kind of expectation of the coming Messiah and that kind of confidence in the authority of the Old Testament, I would find this to be a very good, compelling argument. What if you were a Gentile? How far would that argument go with you? You start using that same kind of terminology to a Gentile, what's a Gentile going to say? Messiah, what's this word Messiah? What are you even talking about? And you're basing this on the Old Testament? Well, we don't believe that. So sometimes people will come to us and say, you're quoting to me something from the Bible, and yet I don't believe the Bible. We need to think really carefully about how we can use the Bible, because it raises this question for all of us. Can we use the Bible in sharing the faith with other people? Is there an answer to that question? It's an interesting question, isn't it? You know what the answer is? Well, yes, you can. Yes, we can, of course, but we need to do it very carefully. If we're basing an argument on the authority of the Bible and expecting people to accept that argument based on the authority of the Bible, how much kind of success do you think we're going to have on that? The same as Paul would have had by quoting the Old Testament to the Gentile people. Notice what he did when he came to Acts 17 with the Gentile people. This is the passage where Paul is in Athens, and he goes up to Mars Hill, the Areopagus, and the place where all the philosophers of the day came with all the latest ideas that they're going to share. And Paul is in the city at the time. And remember, he's been walking around the city, and he sees all the idols there. And he's troubled by what he sees, because here he sees people worshiping idols. In other words, these things here, rather than the creator of all things, are worshiping these idols. And he's troubled, and he begins to talk to people about a man who died and rose again from the dead. Well, the news spreads. There's this man in town, and he's got a new idea. It's an idea about a man who died and rose from the dead. Can't we bring him to the Areopagus? So they brought him there. And what does Paul say when he starts in? Did he start with the Bible? Did he start with Jesus? No. He starts by saying, I see you are a very religious people. It almost sounds like a commendation, doesn't it? I don't think it is quite a commendation, because he was a bit troubled by those idols, but it certainly is an observation that he makes about them. And then what does he say? When I walked around town, he picks out one idol that he saw. Remember this? He says, I saw an idol to what? Remember this? To an unknown God. I saw that idol out there. And he picked on that. He landed on that to make his whole point. And he said, what you worship in ignorance by your own admission, I'm going to proclaim to you. And then he gave them a message about the God whom they already acknowledged was there, and quickly moved to Jesus and the resurrection, the same place he arrived when speaking to the Jews, but had an entirely different way of getting there. And I think we need to do the very same thing. So here's Paul searching for a way to present the gospel of Jesus in a way that's relevant to his hearers. He gave reasons to believe they could relate to. As the audience changed, his way of presenting changed. His reasons changed, even though his message remained exactly the same. And I think that's what we need to do as well. We see a couple of other passages that I find to be interesting here for us about that Paul had an apologetic edge to what he did as well there. And there's Apollos the debater. There's even this debater in the New Testament. And in fact, he said he was a very powerful debater as well. When we think about this point, our message ought to be audience-driven. Let me just ask, how many of you know the name Don Richardson? You know, the missionary who traveled to Indonesia. Do you know that name, Don Richardson? He's quite a guy. Because I like to say the missionaries have been doing what we're talking about here tonight. Missionaries have been doing this for a long time. They go to different cultures of the world. They study the culture, and they learn how to present the gospel well in that culture. Well, Don Richardson was a missionary who took his family, and they went to Indonesia, to the Sawi people. Way back in there, I don't think they'd ever seen white people before, if so, not very many of them. And he's there with his family and getting to know these people, learning how to communicate with them. And eventually he was ready to present to them the gospel story. Does anybody know what happened? He sat down with them. He told them the story about Jesus and the disciples and the betrayal by Judas and the crucifixion of Jesus and all that. And guess who they cheered for? When it was all done, they cheered. Guess who for? Judas. Judas was the hero, because in their culture, it was actually a virtue to cultivate a friendship with somebody, especially from an enemy group, with the purpose of building that friendship to eventually stab the person in the back. And it was a virtue, and he did this par excellence. He did this with the Son of God. He was the hero. And Don Richardson said, wow, that backfired. That was not the way I thought that story was supposed to go. And so he began to think of a different way to present this thing. And he looked around in that culture, and he found this practice called, that he referred to as the peace child. It's where one tribe would take a baby that was born here, and they would send it to another tribe to be raised over here, and they would have a big ceremony where they did. And this baby was then raised in this tribe, so that if they ever went to war, they knew they might be killing their own people. And a baby from here would go to that tribe, and back and forth all around, and that was their way of diminishing war and bloodshed among these people. And Don Richardson said, you know what? I could see how Jesus could be seen as the ultimate peace child. And he picked up on that, and that's why there's a film called The Peace Child, there's a book called The Peace Child, all on this. It seems to me he's doing exactly what we're talking about doing here. It's really exactly the same thing, and I find it really important, something for us to do as well. Just a couple comments about Christian apologetics. What do we mean by Christian apologetics? Well, we defined it this morning. It has all to do with the defense of Christian faith, the communication and defense of Christian faith. And I always say this to my students. There's different ways of defining this term, numerous ways actually. But I think of it as this. When we are involved in apologetics, we are only doing this. We're developing our skills so that we can communicate a Christian message to our world in a way that is accurate. In other words, we don't have any business changing the message once for all delivered to the saints. It's got to be accurate. Number two, in a way that is appealing or relevant. And thirdly, in a way that is credible or defensible. That's what apologetics and what we're doing here is all about today. And I find that to be a very exciting thing. And it divides up into different kinds. And look what we have here for the first one. It's sometimes called negative apologetics, which is simply responding to objections. This kind of apologetics is done when you simply share your testimony with somebody. Say, let me tell you about myself. You telling me about yourself? I'd like to tell you about myself. I'm a Christian. I follow Jesus. I trust the Bible. And I believe that Jesus is actually God revealed in human form, and he died on that cross to pay for the sins of the world. That's what I believe. And the person, and then you stand back and simply wait for the person to see what they have to say. And if they have some questions about that or some objections to it, you begin to respond to them one by one. That's often called negative apologetics. And the idea of it is you can think of a person's objections as a big boulder that they may be standing behind and saying, here's why I could never become a Christian because of all these reasons, all these objections that I have. And the job of the apologist is one by one to take that rock apart, one by one, to say, well, let me ask you, what are your objections? Let's look at them one by one. Let me hear you out really well, and I want to respond to those one by one. And that's what apologetics is all about in the negative sense. And when you get to the end, if you just suppose you've taken that entire boulder down, there's not a single objection left. At that point, you still may say to the person, okay, now, every objection you had is now taken care of. Would you like to become a Christian? Is there any guarantee that person will become a Christian at that point? Not really a guarantee, is there? But at least you've done what you can do. You've taken care of the objections that person has. At that point, you need to be able to say, well, you know what? Okay, you don't have to become a Christian. I mean, it's a free country here. But what you shouldn't say anymore is, I won't become a Christian because I can't. Now you should be saying, I won't become a Christian because I don't want to. Because the reasons you gave me, we've dealt with all those reasons. That's sometimes called negative apologetics, and this can sometimes take years to do this with the person. I mean, this is not an overnight job, and it doesn't need to be. But that's what negative apologetics is all about. The one thing I want to say about it is, once in a while, here's what I find. Here's what I hear. I hear it from students, and I hear it from others I talk to as well. People come and say, well, you know what? That person says he's got all those objections, but you know what I think they are? I think they're just a big smokescreen. I think he really doesn't believe any of that stuff. Okay? And you know what? That may be true. But I would really caution us that may be simply a cop-out on our part to save us from having to do the work of hearing that person's objections and doing the work we need to do to know how to begin to respond to that. It may be. Because here's the deal. If it is a smokescreen on that person's part, if those really aren't the objections he has, well, then you know what the question should be then? Well, then what is behind them? There's something stopping this person. He has some objection, some resistance to Christian faith. What is it? And we'll only get there by talking and hearing a person out. So anyway, that's what negative apologetics is all about. Positive apologetics just means we establish a foundation for the truth of Christian faith, and that's what that's all about. What we're doing here this weekend is more, I guess, what we might call negative apologetics. Okay, now let me move on here to our next point. I'll just go through that part there. Okay, what about, just before I do, any comments at all on what I've just said here? Because I want to ask this question now. When you're challenged, then what? And that's what we'll take a few minutes on this question. But just before I do, does anybody have any comments on what we just said? Any questions or comments at all? I think we can do that if there's one or two. Okay, we'll have time for those later on. Let's move on to this. When you're challenged, then what? In other words, when someone comes to you and they have an objection to something you believe, okay, or something that we've said as Christians, something we believe, something we presented, what do we do then? All right? And here's what I'd like to do. But just before, what we're looking at here is principles, not simply specific answers to specific questions here, because what I'm looking here is principles that apply across the board to all kinds of objections that may come, because as you know, there are many kinds of objections a person can raise. But as I've worked in this area over the last number of years, I begin to see that sometimes there's similarities here, and the same kind of principle can help us here. So just before I put seven of these on the screen here for us, can I just have you turn to the couple of people beside you and say, what ideas do we have by way of principles that can help us respond well. When a person has an objection to what I've just said, what can I do or say at that point that will promote a good, meaningful conversation here? Can I just have you talk to the person around you for 2 or 3 minutes and come up with a couple of ideas here? What do you think? What's helpful? If you want to come up with a couple of ideas that are not helpful, you're welcome to do that as well. But I'm really interested in what is helpful here. To help us have a good conversation, what kind of guidelines and principles can we use here? Any ideas? And then let's share a few of those with us, and then we'll look at this together. Just turn to a couple of people around you and do that. Thanks. Okay, could I have your attention up here? I'd like to hear what some of you are saying here. What are some guidelines or some principles that can actually help us in having good, meaningful conversations? If someone has an objection to what we've said, maybe they could be hostile, or they could be just very seriously asking a question, or maybe they're just seeking, but they got a question, something that they disagree with. Any comments, any suggestions here for us? Just give us what you're thinking here. I see a hand being raised by somebody else at the back there. Okay. So was that a reluctant observation at the back? I'm not sure. You going to give it to us? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How many of you said something? What happened there? What did I do? Did you run into my suit or a jacket or something? Okay, yeah. How many said something like that one said here? That's an interesting idea, isn't it? Somehow to legitimize, whatever the word is, there it went again, I think, legitimize the question that's asked. In other words, to let the person know, that's a pretty fair question you've got there. And maybe it's a question you've struggled with or you've seen other people struggle with as well. I don't see any problem with that at all. I think it's a great idea to do that, all right? You know what, once in a while, why not put yourself in somebody else's shoes and say, you know what, I can imagine if I was in your shoes, I could be asking that question. Not a bad way to start. Anybody else? Okay. Okay. That's actually pretty important. Anybody else say something like that? I mean, it's actually not a bad policy for life in general. That's why they say honesty is the best policy. But if you're going to be a teacher, I heard a long time ago. In fact, I actually asked my father when I started teaching, because was he one of your teachers, Valen? Okay, see, there we go. Valen and I go back way too far. It's actually not even good that we're thinking about how far we go back here. But my father was one of Valen's teachers. But when I went in to start teaching, I asked him, because he'd been teaching for a long time, and I said, what would you tell somebody just starting to teach? And he said one thing right off the bat: don't bluff. Don't make it look like you know the answer to something when you really don't. And because he said if you don't know the answer, people will know you don't anyway. You might be fooling yourself, but you won't be fooling anybody else. And then you'll lose your credibility right off the bat. And I think that's the point here. If you don't know an answer, I think it's much wiser just to say, you know, that's a good question. I don't know the answer now. Is there anything we can add to that? What if the person says, well, if you don't know the answer, why are you still a Christian? I mean, it depends what the question is, really. But maybe you could say, I know I don't have a good answer to that question. I'm either going to check into that because I think I need to, or you might be able to say, let me tell you why that has not stopped me from being a Christian. That seems to me to be a fair comment to make. Anybody else? Yes, right here, sir. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, a common denominator in something you both are agreed upon. Yeah, I think that's good. That's the way usually good reasoning. That's how good reasoning works anyway. If you're sitting over here on different positions, and that's all you have, then you're just talking past each other, total disagreement. Can you back up and say, well, look, do we both agree on this, and find a point at which we do, and then work from there. That's a really important reasoning strategy, just for all of life, including this as well. These are good. Any others? Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. You know, that's really interesting because that sounds a little bit like what Paul did in Acts 17. I'm finding a bridge here, a point of contact, and that's what Ted's getting at here too. If the folks you're talking to believe in the Creator, maybe it's a different Creator, maybe they label it differently, maybe they have a whole bunch of different ideas about a Creator, but they do believe in a Creator. That's a very important point of contact that you're able to get at. I would certainly affirm that, that's for sure. Listen, good thoughts. Let me mention a few here that I found to be very helpful to me. And the first one is this. But well, here just a couple comments on me before I get to my 7 I've got. First of all, a couple of initial observations I'd make about challenges and objections when they come our way. And the first one is just this. Have you seen the same thing I've seen, that objections and obstacles to faith come in many shapes and sizes? Is that not correct? And to the point where if you are really, really willing to engage people about Christian faith, I think it's fair to say you really don't know what objections you're going to face that day. If you're willing to say, I'm going to go out today and I'm going to be willing to face people that have objections to my faith and hear what they have to say, is there any guarantee that you're going to get something that you are prepared for? Not really, is there? Which means what? Is there any guarantee you're going to have a good answer for every objection you face? No, I mean, there really isn't, is there? Objections come in many shapes and many sizes, and that's the point of it. But which leads me to my second one, what I sometimes call the fear factor. That can make us very afraid. If we think we need to have a perfect answer for every objection that comes our way, and yet we still, when we know that we don't have any way of predicting what those objections are going to be, we're out there saying, you know what, I could be in trouble here. This whole thing could really freak me out. I would say we need to think about that fear factor and say, we need to realize this is God's work. He's drawing people to himself, as we mentioned this morning. And number two, as was said over here, somewhere over here, we need to be prepared to say, I don't know. And once in a while, let me just say one more thing about that I don't know answer. I think that you can actually even gain credibility with people saying, I don't know. Have you ever seen that? What I mean is this. Have you ever run into people who seem to have a pat answer for every question you raise about anything? Have you seen those kind of folks? How do you feel? You know what? We have a little trouble with that, don't we? You know why? It's because we don't think there is anybody who has knowledge on every single subject matter so that his answers are going to be that credible, that good. Especially when it comes to something as big as religion and faith and spirituality. These are huge, big areas here. And I don't think people are all that impressed with somebody who has a pat answer for every single question they ask on a topic that big. I think they're perfectly prepared to have you and me once in a while say, you know what, I just don't know the answer to that. This is a really, really big topic. I don't know that answer. I'd be happy to check it out. We might even gain credibility, and I'll tell you this, we'll take a lot of pressure off ourselves, and we can enjoy this task a lot more if we're just prepared to say, I don't know, to certain questions that may come our way. So that's all I'd say about those. Let me go into the seven I have here for us. The first one, a very simple idea here, but it's to clarify the objection. But let me tell you, it's simple, but I want to say how much success I have had personally with this one. This is, in my mind, probably the most significant one of all seven that I will give you in terms of my own personal experience. Because the point we're getting at here is that when someone gives us an objection, I think we need to, well, the point of this is, it's to help us avoid a shouting match and to enhance good communication, because very often what happens is a person will give an objection to us, but it'll be pretty hazy, it'll be a little bit vague, somewhat ambiguous, sometimes passionate, sometimes emotional, and you know what, and they might even say some things that are quite offensive or that really bother us, some things that offensive to things that are important to us, like maybe the Bible or Jesus or God. They're saying these kinds of things. And what's our first reaction? I'll tell you what my first instinctive reaction is, to blurt out a response right off the bat to what we hear. Well, I can tell you in almost every case, we are far better to say, you know what, maybe I need to have you back up a little bit and clarify exactly what you mean with this objection, and go back and just have them break the thing down into certain parts. And sometimes you take 10, 15, 20 minutes having a person just do nothing other than clarify the objection and talk about what the issue is. I have had real success doing this in my own experience. This has probably been the most helpful little technique I've ever come across. Because the bottom line is this: I want to respond to your objection, but I can't do it unless I understand it. What exactly are you saying? Why are you saying it? Give me your reasons, your arguments, and then I'd be able to be in a better position. I remember one time having given a lecture up at UBC. I think it was a lecture, a debate, one or the other, I forget. But I got all done. And a young man came walking to the front. And he was really, really confident. And he had a whole crowd of people with him. Walked up and he said to me, there's two things in life I can't stand. I said, yeah, what are those? One's philosophy, and the other is Christianity. Well, since I was there as a Christian spokesman, that day, and my PhD is in philosophy, he pretty well had me nailed on both counts. And so we got talking for a minute, and he says, you know, I think I could disprove Christianity for you in 5 minutes. I said, well, okay, go ahead, take your best shot. And everybody was right there with him. He was really on fire. So he starts in, and he says, well, I can tell you right now that the flood never happened. Well, first of all, I asked him, what are you into? He says, I'm into science. I said, so science has got the truth, got the answers? Yeah, science is it. It will get you truth, it'll get you evidence, it works with hard facts, and it gets at things that are really true. I said, okay. So, and interestingly enough, there's a lot of people in our culture that are exactly where this young man is. Anyway, and so I said, okay, go ahead and disprove Christianity. Well, I'm not sure where you're going with this, but go ahead. He says, I can tell you right now, scientifically proven, science can show you that there was no flood. I said, okay, so what is your argument here? Let me get your argument really, really clear here. I just got to get this. And really all I was doing was clarifying at this point. I said, your argument is what? let's get this thing in some premises or whatever. There is no flood, because I'm going to assume for a moment that argument's true, because as a matter of fact, Christians do have different perspectives on the flood, but the vast majority think there was one. And either local or universal, it's right there in the text. Okay, but I'm going to assume for your argument for just a moment, just to get your argument figured out here. There was no flood, therefore what? What follows from that? There was no flood, therefore Christianity is false? Does that follow from that? Does that conclusion follow from that premise? And it says, or there was no flood, therefore there is no God? Does that follow from that premise? And I wasn't sure exactly where to go with that, and I said, I don't see how this conclusion, because you've given a great big conclusion to start with, Christianity is false. I don't see how this premise is going to get you to this conclusion. He says, well, okay, let me give you another one. And the other one was this. He says, I can also show you scientifically that there was no historical, literal Adam and Eve. I said, well, there again, Christians, theologians have different ways of interpreting Genesis 1 and 2. But let me take your position just as it stands. There was no Adam and Eve, therefore what? There was no God. Does that follow from that? I don't even see a connection between this conclusion and this premise here. There was no Adam and Eve, and therefore Christianity is false. Does this follow from that or what? Finally, he says to me, this all took about 20 minutes, by the way. He says, is that all you're going to do? He says to me. I said, well, all I'm doing is asking you your argument. I'm still clarifying what your argument is, because I can't really evaluate your argument until I find out what your argument is. And after quite a while, he admitted, and I couldn't resist. I said, I think you could use a course in philosophy, because you're making, you got some syllogisms here which really aren't working very well. You got premises which are not leading to your conclusions at all. And I said, and you're making really big conclusions and making huge dogmatic statements, but the basis for it does not get you there. And you can see that, can't you? And after a while he could. I said, let me just ask you this. Have you ever read any scientific arguments in favor of the flood? He said, no. I said, you know what? Think of what you're saying here then. You know scientifically there was no flood. You know the arguments against the flood are stronger than the arguments for the flood, but you don't know what the arguments for the flood are. You see that? And he said, yeah. How about the same thing for Adam and Eve? Same thing. I said, you know what? Do yourself a favor. Get a hold of some information by Dr. Hugh Ross. That's one person I mentioned. There's others you could have had him read as well, who have made arguments in favor of the flood. At least read those arguments for yourself, the scientific data on that yourself. That whole thing was probably about a 30-minute conversation. And I would say that we probably had about as meaningful and productive a conversation as we could ever have, given where he was at the beginning. And really, I did not much more than clarify where he was at and continue to poke away and find out what are your arguments, what your premises, what's your conclusion, how does this get you there, etc. That's about all I did. Now, some of you may go about it differently. I went about it that way because that's my background, but I would still say clarifying is really, really a helpful thing to do. There was one other lecture I gave one time out at Ontario recently at a university there, and a young man came up to me. That lecture was called 3 Distinctive Messages Christianity Presents to the World. The Christian organizers on the university said, we have many, many Muslims on our campus, and they're promoting hard the notion that Islam is not really very different from Christianity. And so they're encouraging lots of Christians to take another good look at Islam and try to convince them that it really isn't very different at all. And we need to emphasize the distinctives of Christianity. So they asked me I said, how about I give a lecture that says 3 Messages Christianity Presents to the World. They wanted the word distinctive in there, so we put the word distinctive in there. 3 distinctive messages Christianity presents to the world. I got all done presenting that. And there again, Q&A time and then conversation time. And a young man walked up to me with his Christian friends. His name was Muhammad, a Muslim man, 6'6", way up there. And he had just arrived in the country from Iran. A really, really nice young guy, way different attitude than this other fellow I was talking to. And he walked in there and the group said, hi, this is Muhammad. He just arrived from Iran. He's new to the country. He's a student here, and he's got some questions about Christianity. I said, yeah, great, Muhammad. Welcome to our country, and what are your questions and all that? So he talked for a while. He said, well, my question is about the Trinity. And if you know anything about Islam, they do have difficulty with the Trinity. A lot of people do. We ourselves sometimes struggle with the Trinity, don't we? But the Muslims certainly do. Well, I looked at the young man, and I said, and there again, I just said, I'm going to do follow the same principle. I said, what is your objection, or what is your issue with the Trinity? And he said, well, and he thought about it for a moment. He says, it seems to me there's a contradiction built into the Trinity. There's a contradiction somewhere there. I said, okay, that's a fairly serious charge. And I thought, I better keep going with my clarification principle. I said, where is the contradiction exactly that you see? And he kind of worked with it. He wasn't really too sure how to get to that because that's a little bit intricate there. I found but we talked about it for a couple minutes. I said, let me tell you what I think about the Trinity, Muhammad. I said, I think that we as Christians are very happy to admit that the Trinity is filled with mystery. There's a lot of mystery there. I don't think you'll ever be able to show a contradiction in the Trinity. I said, if you could, that would be a problem even to a person like me as a Christian. But I said, here we need to think about what it means for something to be a contradiction. If the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity taught that there is one God, and at the same time there are three gods, that would be a contradiction, wouldn't it? But you know what? The doctrine of the Trinity doesn't teach that. If it taught there's one person, and at the same time three persons, that would be a contradiction too, but it doesn't teach that either. What it teaches is that somehow, in some mysterious way, there are three persons bound up in one substance, one Godhead. And that's what the doctrine of the Trinity teaches. We don't accept this because we made it up or we think it's easy to understand or anything like that. We simply accept it because we find our scriptures teaching it. We find the scriptures teaching us four things that we have to put together. Number one is there's a person who is Father called God, a Son called God, a Spirit called God. But the Bible is also very clear there is only one God. That's common to both of our theologies. There's one God. When we put that all together, we come up with something like the Trinity. And I said, you know what? I actually love the Trinity, Muhammad. I love it. Because as one of our better thinkers, C.S. Lewis, said, that the Trinity looks very much like an idea that human beings did not invent. As Lewis says, if I looked at our doctrine of God and found it to be very easy to understand and very simple, I would just assume that some human being made it up. Because that's the kind of thing human beings made up. This does not look like an idea that human beings would have invented. And I said, but there's another reason I love it. It explains something about human nature. We as humans are very much relational beings. We're social beings. Where did we get that from? Christianity tells us we're made in God's image. He himself is a relational being. In his very nature, he's a social, relational being. But how can that be if he existed for eternity with just one being, one person? There's three persons existing together in the one Godhead in an eternal relationship there, making God inherently and innately a relational being. And we are made in his image. It explains why we are relational beings as well. I said, I love the doctrine of the Trinity. In fact, Christians tend to, because as you know, as you see, we put it on everything. Even though we don't claim to understand it very well, we put it on our schools, like the ones I teach at, our camps, our churches, our resort centers. It's all over the place. We seem to be very happy, okay, with the word Trinity. And you know what? It turned out, in my mind, again, to be a very useful conversation. And almost all I did was with Muhammad to get that going was to clarify and then simply pick up some ideas about the Trinity that I wanted to share with him. I found this, if I can just commend this to you, to be a really helpful principle to promote some good conversation, to take your time and clarify and just let a person speak and explain where they're coming from and why. Listen, there's 6 more I'm going to get into, and we'll do them a lot more quickly than this one. But we need to take a break, and where's Dave here? There he is. He's just going to make a couple of little announcements as we go to the break here. Thanks, Dave. People are asking me how I think I'm going to get through 6 more of these. And we're going to do it a lot more quickly than you might think. But listen, if you have your notes there, let me look at some other of these guidelines for responding to objections that come our way. I think it's really important for us to be well prepared when people come to us with questions, objections, whether they be friendly or searching or hostile, whatever it may be. That's why we're doing this. The first one, to clarify the objection, I really think it helps us to avoid a shouting match and make for a good conversation. But the second one is this. What are we calling it up there? Return to, what are we saying here? Return to foundational truths. Yeah, this is one I picked up from Ravi Zacharias. I had the privilege of working with Ravi for about 1.5 years total. And got to know Ravi a little bit. He's a very gifted man in apologetic work and speaking and writing and many different levels. And Ravi makes quite a big point about this, that once in a while, an objection that comes our way, and I bet some of you have faced this, comes at a very personal and emotional level, and sometimes we're not really sure how to respond. In fact, let me tell you what the exact thing that happened to Ravi, and it happened to me later on one time too. One time a number of times like this, but one time was almost word for word what happened to Ravi, and I'll bet some happened to some of you as well. He got done giving a lecture to a group of people. When he got all done, Q&A time, and somebody raised his hand and said, are you telling me, Dr. Zacharias, that my mother, who was a very good woman, very good person, who died a month ago, is not in heaven because she didn't believe in your God and pray your prayer? Is that what you're saying? Now, what is the best way to answer that question? What would you say? Would you say, well, that's what I'm saying, amen. Next question, please. Or is there something better we could maybe say? I mean, what would we say to something like this to be as wise and careful as we can? Well, let me tell you what Rabbi said, and it fits with the second principle we're putting up here now. Rabbi said, listen to this, and because see, the point is this. It's hard to know how to win that person or win that conversation if you just immediately begin talking about the mother and getting into the personal, emotional case that the person's brought to you. Here's what Rabbi said. He said, you know what? I want to honor your mother for her good life of kindness. If she was a kind and good person, I want to honor her for that. He says, and I don't know where your mother is right now because I'm not sure what business she may have done with God during her life or at the end of her life. But I can tell you this. I do know that God has provided a way for all people to come to him through Jesus. And that's the most important thing I can tell you here today. What do you think about that answer? There's really three parts to it when you think about it, aren't there? The first one is, I want to honor your mother for her goodness and for her life of kindness. Is there anything wrong with doing that? I don't see why we wouldn't do that, and he did that. And then how about that second part? I don't know where your mother is right now because I don't know what business she may have done with God. Is that a fair and accurate statement? I think it is. And you know what it does? It allows him to move to the big foundational truth he wanted to get to, which is that God has provided a way for all people to come to him through Jesus, and that's the most important thing I can tell you. In other words, that's what Ravi was there to say. That's the message he wanted to bring to those people, and he very quickly got back to that message. And that's what I would just say for us. If we can if at all possible, if we can avoid going off on rabbit trails down personal, emotional cases, we'll probably be a lot wiser off. So that's the second one. Let me go to the third one here. There's a couple of distinctions we need to make here. And the first one is this. We need to distinguish between, when we're dealing with objections that come to us, what some people have done in the name of Christianity, do you know what I mean? In the name of God or name of Christianity, versus what Christianity really is and what it really teaches. You see what I'm getting at with that one? I think this is a really important distinction to make. We could talk about this at length. But very early on in my time, when I got involved in apologetic speaking and whatnot, I began to realize we are called to defend one of these, namely the second one, but not the first. When we do Christian apologetics, are we called upon to defend everything everybody has ever done in the name of Christianity? No, we are not called upon to do that, and we never could. And we might as well ask, have people done things in the name of Christianity which are not true representations of Jesus' teaching? Sure. Have we ever done those kind of things? Sure. I mean, those are pretty easy questions. And sometimes when people do that, they cause real difficulty and real problems for us. But you see, there's a principle here I think we've got to keep in mind, and that is this. You can never judge something by its abuse or by its neglect. You see what I'm saying here? You can't judge Christianity by the way somebody's abused it or neglected it, and you can't judge really anything by that. I mean, whether it be, well, put it this way. The fact that someone can abuse a belief system or ideal, whatever it is never a good reason standing alone to reject that belief system. That's what we're talking about here today. How about something like liberty? Is liberty a pretty important ideal? Yeah, it is. But have there been crimes committed in the name of liberty? Yeah, how about something like nationalism? Is that pretty important? Seems to me it's a good idea. But you know, there's some people out there who are very wary of nationalism. You know why? Because around the world, nationalism has been the force behind some real horrible actions that have taken place. We could say the same thing about equality, same thing about patriotism, and you know what? Sadly, you could say the same thing about Christianity. In the name of Christianity, people have done some things they ought never to have done. And these have all been abuses, and it does happen. But I think our response ought to be to people, you know what, you condemn these people for having what they've done. Well, you know what, so do I. But the fact that these people are doing these things does not show, and here's the point, does not show that Christianity is false. It doesn't show that Christianity is violent. It doesn't show that Christianity is immoral or any such thing. Because while people may be claiming to act in the name of Jesus or God, the fact is their actions actually violate the teachings of Jesus and the Bible. And that's the point we need to be getting to. And then at that point, we need to be prepared to point out what are the true teachings of Jesus in the Bible. See where I'm going with that? So I think it's a really important distinction we need to make. That's one important distinction. And very often when people are sending particular objections your way, if you look at them really carefully, they end up being an objection to what somebody has done in the name of Christianity. People will say things like, well, Christianity as an institution has been quite sexist. Okay, what's that mean? That means some Christians have done things which are sexist. Isn't that what that means? The question really is, was Jesus a sexist? That's really the question that we should be asking here. Because I'm here to defend what Jesus taught, what he said. I'm not here really to defend what all the people who call themselves Christians have done on this or any issue like that. What's really important for us is to make this distinction, and we're prepared to defend what it is that Jesus taught and what he said. That's one important distinction. There's another one for apologetics and evangelism, another distinction, and it's this one. We need to distinguish between what I call the essentials, or what we might say essential, non-negotiable, historical Christian truths, sometimes called the core. Okay, and what do we mean by that? What are some examples of that? Things that Christians have believed everywhere you've ever found Christians. Okay, wherever and whenever. In other words, things like this. The existence of a God who is just and loving. You have never found Christians anywhere who didn't believe in that. Okay, or the historical reality of Jesus, the God-man. And in fact, that's what Christianity tells us. There's a God up there who revealed himself in the person of Jesus. How about this? Salvation by grace through faith. How about that? The authority of Scripture, the second coming of Jesus. These are essential ideas that Christians have believed anywhere you've ever found them. Is that not correct? But you know, there's a number of secondary issues as well. And we need to think about some of those. What do we mean by secondary issues? Well, I mean issues where people who have a high view of the Bible, who have studied it very carefully, sometimes come to different conclusions. You know what I'm saying? These are usually not part of the creeds. They're not part of the foundations of the faith. They're things Christians believe in, but they believe differently when you find them. How about this for an example? Predestination. Do Christians everywhere believe that? No, some believe it very passionately, but some believe the opposite very passionately. How about eternal security? The same thing. What about end times issues? Christians believe Jesus will come again. You will find that all across the board. But will his coming be pre-tribulation? Will it be post-tribulation? Will it be mid-tribulation? How about that one? When I was a seminary student down in Chicago years ago, there was a big, huge debate. It really was a national debate held on our campus in Chicago because the Evangelical Free Church was coming together and they were debating this question of whether or not Jesus' coming would be pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, and the Free Church had been pre-tribulation up until that time. But in the doctrinal statement of the EFC of America, it said his coming would be imminent. And that was interpreted fairly broadly by some. And so there were people on the faculty where I was going to school who believed all those different positions. And people were adamant on one position or the other position, so they were going to hold a big debate on campus with three professors. And one of the ones, Dr. Gleason Archer. Anybody ever heard his name? Big name in Old Testament studies at the time. Wrote lots of stuff. He and I attended the same church together. In fact, my claim to fame was that I actually helped him change his flat tire one day in the church parking lot. My claim to fame was Gleason Archer. But he was a man who worked with 26 different languages, like Hebrew, Arabic, Ugaritic, all these languages. He had many, many coins, a coin collection he kept in safe deposit boxes in the banks. And he'd bring us to his home and bring these coins out from all around the world. And he was a wealth, like an encyclopedia of information. He was involved in this debate. And he was defending the mid-tribulation position. I saw him one day and I said, Dr. Archer, I hear you're defending the mid-tribulation position in the upcoming debate. And he said this, yes, I am, because of insuperable difficulties with each of the other positions. Okay, that was his position. This had insuperable difficulties, that one had insuperable difficulties, so it had to be this one down the middle. And so that's what he was defending. Well, but that's just one example. I mean, there are others as well. A premillennial versus amillennial position. The role of women in leadership in the church. Origins of the earth. These are debated. Christians don't always hold to the same position on these. I mean, have you noticed that around the world? I mean, Christians who have a high view of the Bible and who study it carefully. And I would just say, we need to remember that there's some things which are the essentials, and those are the ones that when we are communicating faith to others, we are communicating what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity, these essentials, what John Stott called basic Christianity, these essential core. That's what we're communicating to others and defending. And when people come into the kingdom of God and begin to study the Bible for themselves and read and hear what their tradition is teaching them, they will begin to take positions on these other questions. But when we are out there communicating the faith to people, we are hoping, like everything, to be able to focus them on the essential, non-negotiable core of the historic Christian faith and communicate and defend those to people. And here's the point to remember, that once you've allowed a person to clarify the objection, you will be surprised how many times that objection is only to somebody's view, your view or somebody's view, on a secondary matter. And here's what I think our goal ought to be, to never let our view on a secondary issue stand in the way of a person considering and embracing the core Christian message, mere Christianity. That Jesus died on that cross. He offers you a free gift of eternal life. You can receive that by faith. This is the core, what we want to have people focus on and not be sidetracked by the secondary matters. I don't for a moment want to say the secondary matters are unimportant. They're important and they need to be worked through by people once they're into the kingdom of God, but they need to be worked through carefully with the teachers that God has given us, theologians and teachers who work through these things in a very careful fashion. Let me go to the fifth one here. What is our goal in communicating and defending Christian faith? Let me ask you this. Is our goal to make the Christian message palatable, or should we say acceptable, to everybody? You can see I put a line through that one. And this is an interesting question. I've thought about this in the past. You see, when we are involved in Christian apologetics, what are we trying to do? We're doing everything we can to try to settle objections, aren't we? And try to clear the way so a person could consider coming into the kingdom of God and embracing the Christian gospel. And you know what the temptation is? The temptation is to say just about anything and everything to set aside that obstacle so the person can then consider embracing the gospel. But you know what? That isn't our goal, and there actually is a temptation in doing that. The temptation and the tendency, the danger, I should say, is to maybe compromise some important truth. And I think we just need to remember, our goal really is to do what Paul said, to communicate the truth on an issue raised as clearly and winsomely as we can. And then we ultimately, in the end, we're leaving the results in the hands of God. I mean, that's ultimately what we're doing here. But that's one principle. Let me go to number 6. This is one I've just added recently, and that is this. Let us take heart in the enormous resources available to us in the Christian community. What's my point on this? I'm not sure if we realize just how huge the Christian community is, not just around the world today, but it goes back a couple thousand years. And sometimes we as evangelicals aren't that good at remembering that we actually have a history, and the issues that we're covering today have been covered by other people and dealt with and addressed, and sometimes in really strikingly amazing ways, hundreds and hundreds of years ago at times. The resources we have are enormous. My point in getting at it is this, that there are times, are there not, where we may hear an objection or a challenge to our faith. Maybe you've heard one like this some time ago. And when someone presents it, it seems so hard, it seems so new to you, and you're saying something like this, you know what, I have never heard anybody raise that one before. I never even thought about that before. In fact, I don't even know what to do with it, and we begin to wonder, is there an answer? What if there's not an answer? I'll bet none of my friends in my church has ever heard this one before. That can be pretty tough, can't it? And these thoughts have the potential to throw us into a real existential or faith tailspin. I just talked to a young engineer some time back, about a year and a half ago, and he's a Christian guy. He's a professional engineer. He went to a Bible college, was very active in his church even now, but he was going to be going out for a whole weekend out, I think, to the Bahamas to work with a colleague who was not a Christian. And he said, this is going to be a good opportunity. I think I want to share my faith with this guy. So he even asked people in his church to pray for him. He went out there, and when they got there, he began to do it, and he found out that not only was this fellow not a Christian, but he had been a Christian as a young person. And when he was about 16 or 17 years old, he looked at a whole bunch of questions. He couldn't square these questions, couldn't get answers that satisfied him. He threw the whole thing off. And he had spent the rest of his life churning out all kinds of objections and challenges to Christian faith, and he knew his Bible inside out. He had all kinds of questions about authorship, about copyist errors, about contradictions in the Bible, and about the history of the Christian church. One by one by one, everything my friend said was just set aside, and objection after objection was given him that he could not answer. By the time he came back, my friend was the one going through a real crisis. And he went through it for almost an entire year. I talked to him on the phone a few times. He said, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about that weekend and what happened there. So I eventually got him to send me an email and said, send me every single thing you heard. Every single thing you heard, I want to have in this email. So I got a big long one with issue after issue raised. And it is really quite something. And I was thinking to myself, you know what? Maybe the reason we can't relate to that is because we never put ourselves out there and let someone who really, really understands their stuff go ahead and give us all their objections. But what if we do? Are we ready for that? Well, I can pretty well say loud and clear to us here that although those objections that my friend heard were new to him, they were not new. Okay? And I would even say to you, there's not an objection out there, a challenge that you and I will ever face, that has not already been faced by someone, somewhere in the Christian community, and probably responded to by someone as well. You see, this is what I call the beauty of the Christian community. It is huge, it is rich, it is deep. And as Colin mentioned, some of the people we're going to get to the big conference in March, these are just a sampling of the people around the world who get into issues and go into them in a deep way. Sometimes we don't even know what they're doing. They're working on these issues, and some of them will take years on one issue, going into it in such depth, but it's there for the rest of us to draw on. And the Christian community contains many scholars, many thinkers who have wrestled with these. So the point is, none of us is alone. There's always help available somewhere in the Christian community, regardless of what issue someone raises to you. And I would just really want us to be encouraged by that fact. I found it to be a very encouraging fact. And so if we hear something that is brand new to us, we should at the very least be saying, well, okay, who has raised this before? Where in the Christian community are the people who respond to this? I need to get to this and find out what we're saying about this issue. And I can pretty well guarantee you there will be somebody who's done that. The seventh one is just this. You may think I'm being kind of frivolous here, but I'm really not. Use humor and enjoy the process. As I've been saying from the beginning here, we really aren't in this on our own to try to bring people into the kingdom of God with our best reasoning and our best argumentation. I mean, we're trying to do the best we can. There's no doubt about that. But let's realize this is God's work. He's drawing people to himself. He just gives us an opportunity to be a part of it. And I think that can take a lot of pressure off us as we get involved. We simply have an opportunity to represent the King of Kings and a message of the Christian gospel to the people of our world. What can be better than that? And we get to do that. And so I think we should be able to really enjoy this process. Okay. Any last comments on this? Anybody have anything to add, by the way, before we push on? We've only got a few minutes here, but I want to push on to the next issue. And we'll get it started, and we'll pick it up again tomorrow. Any last comment or question from anybody here? Okay. Let me go to this next one. 3 kinds of people. Now, before I go on this, have you ever heard people say there's 3 kinds of people in the world? Nothing yet. I don't. There we go. Okay. Yeah, that was. I'll just use this for the remainder of this evening. Thanks, guys. 3 kinds of people. Well, listen. I mentioned Did I mention my dad earlier? He's a man who had a very dry sense of humor, about the driest I've ever heard. Okay, he'd crack these jokes. Most people wouldn't get them. We always got them because we were trained to get these jokes. Okay, but when people didn't get them, he thought that was kind of funny too. Maybe, I'm not sure if Alan, if you picked up on that, but he used to say there's 3 kinds of people in the world. You ready for this? This is about as dry as it gets. Those who can count and those who can't. That's it. That's the story right there. So I don't know if you like that kind of humor or not, but that's the kind of thing I endured for my growing up years. Where do we start here? 3 kinds of people. Well, we're looking at 3 kinds of people here today to help us think a little bit about how to carry on conversation with people who think very differently than we do on issues like this. Let me put these up here for a moment. The theist. What does it mean to be a theist? Well, a theist is basically a person who believes there is a God. All right? If you are a Christian, you're a theist. Tell me, do you have to be a Christian to be a theist? No, you don't, do you? You can be a different kind of theist. Person who believes there's a God there, a creator, just like Ted was mentioning here earlier, you're a theist of some kind. How about the next one, an atheist? What's an atheist? Well, a person who says there is not a God. You can see how that word works. If you look at the word atheist, it takes a little Greek letter alpha and puts it on the front of the word theist, or theos. Theos is a Greek word for God, and we simply negate the word by putting the little word alpha on the front of it, just like we negate words in English as well. And so the atheist is the person who believes there is not a God, there is no God. How about the next position? What's the next one? Agnostic. What does it mean to be an agnostic? Can you tell me? Anybody tell me? Agnostic is the person who says what? It says, I don't know. Anybody else? I don't know? Or is there any other way of saying it? I cannot know. We have two different flavors here of agnosticism. We might as well really get them on the table here right off to begin with. The skeptic is a person who says, I just don't know whether or not there is a God. Okay, I just don't feel like I've been given enough information to take a position on something that big. What's the other position here, the dogmatic agnostic, or maybe the hard agnostic? What's that person saying? He's making a much stronger claim, isn't he? We cannot know whether or not there is a God, and that really is a different claim, isn't it? Now, here's the point I want to make first off on these three positions here, and it's a really important point for us to get clear on, because I don't think we can go any further till we get this. But I find it to be a point that often is missing in discussions on this issue, and that is this. All of these truth claims, apart from the skeptic, so look what we have up there. We have the theist, we have the atheist, and then we have the dogmatic agnostic. Take those three truth claims. All of those, am I correct in saying, all of those are in fact truth claims. In other words, they all assert that something is the case and the opposite is false. Is that not correct? What's a theist assert? There is a God. And it would make sense to come to the theist then and say, well, can you give me some reason for believing that? Because you just made a claim. That would make sense, wouldn't it? How about the atheist? You say to somebody, where do you stand on this question? And the atheist says, I'm an atheist. So you believe there is no God? Yes, that's what I believe. Does it make sense to go to that person and say, well, can you give me some reason for thinking there is no God? Does that make sense? Yeah, because that person is making a truth claim too. How about the dogmatic agnostic? Go to that person and say, where do you stand? The person says, well, we just can't know that kind of thing. Does it make sense to say, how can you know that? Can you give me some reason for thinking we cannot know? It does, doesn't it? Because he's making a truth claim too. He's actually making a fairly big truth claim. He's saying there's many other things in the world we can know. This is one of the things we can't know. And it would make sense to go to that person and say, well, okay, what reason can you give for thinking that's true? And then this comes in very different form, all kinds of different forms. But if we can develop an ear for this, then we can begin to pick up, here, this is a dogmatic agnostic. The only position that doesn't do that is a skeptic. I mean, what if you go to a skeptic and you say, where do you stand on this issue? The person says, well, I just don't know. What if you said, prove that? Prove what? There's nothing really to prove there, is there? Because all he's saying is, I just don't know, okay? That's the one position that really has nothing to prove on this. And I think it's really interesting, an important point to make, because here's what I find. I find that so very often the impression is just given, and in fact assumed, that there's only one of those positions up there, namely, which one do you think I'm talking about, that really believes something and therefore has a job to prove it. And which one is that, of course? Theism. So very often this is just the impression that's given, and this is a really, really important point to make for us if we want to have meaningful conversations with people, because the impression often given is this: well, of course we know theists are making a claim. They're making a great big claim. There's a God up there. What a huge claim. Atheism, that's just the absence of belief. We're just atheists. And agnostics, we just don't know. So there's only one person called upon to make a case for their position, and that's theism. And I'll tell you why that's so significant, because then the atheist or the agnostic can sit back and say, well, if I'm not convinced by the case he made it for his theism, I guess I'm justified in holding to my position here. It's a very different thing when we point out, actually, there's three truth claims going on here. Theism is one, atheism is another, dogmatic agnosticism is another, are all making truth claims, and here's the big point, any time a truth claim is made, evidence or argument is required to support it. And I think we should be willing to point out to dogmatic agnostics and atheists as well that unless you're willing to believe your position on pure blind faith, you have the same job as the rest of us to give some kind of reason as to why we should hold to your position. And I find this has been a really helpful thing to me in having conversations. So when someone comes and says, and we're talking, and I say, well, where do you stand on this issue? Person says, well, I'm just an atheist. I think the first question should be, well, let me tell you what happened here. William Lane Craig, when he taught me apologetics. And way back then, he gave a little story about being on the bus with somebody. And this exact question came up when talking on the bus. He said, where do you stand? The fellow said, I'm an atheist. And Bill Craig just said, you mean you think you can really prove to me there's no God? You can actually prove that? And the person said, well, no, I guess I probably couldn't prove that. I guess I'm not really that sure about that. And Bill said, it sounds to me like you're more like an agnostic. And the fellow said, yeah, that's probably what I am. Well, think about that. In those few minutes on the bus, changed his position from being an atheist to an agnostic. And that's a very different position. That changes the conversation, doesn't it? Because if you're an agnostic, and I mean particularly if it's a skeptical one, which is probably what he was, now the person has some openness because now he's not saying there's no God. He's just saying he doesn't know. And if you don't know something, you're always a little more open to investigate than if you do know the thing doesn't exist. Is that not correct? If you know there's no God, why would you bother looking for God? But if you're saying, I actually don't know whether there's a God or not, that's a whole different position. And I think this has the opportunity to open up really helpful conversations for us. Well, the question at this point is, how do we go about making the case for these different positions here? Well, it seems to me, my experience has always been that it's commonly thought that if you had to prove theism, atheism, or particularly dogmatic agnosticism, the hardest one to prove by far would be theism. I mean, how do you go about proving there's a God? Proving atheism, that shouldn't be any big deal. Proving there is a God, how do you do that? Well, I'd like to say, actually, that probably the easiest one of all three of these to prove, to make a case for, would be theism. But let's talk about the other two first of all. What's involved in proving, well, I mean, let's talk about proving theism first of all, and then we'll get to atheism tomorrow. Maybe that's a better way. What's involved in proving theism? Interesting question here, isn't it? Well, let me just say in brief, proving, let me just put it down that way. In proving, and I have the word prove in quotations here, because what I really mean is to make a case for it. I don't think we can prove the existence of God with some kind of absolute certainty, like a mathematical proof or something like that. But I do think we can make a good case for it. What's involved in making a case for the existence of God? Well, it comes down to this, finding some evidence which points to the existence of God. You see what I'm getting at there? That's what it really comes down to. The theist is the person who looks around the universe, looks around the world, and says, I see this and that and that and that. These are all evidence, pieces of evidence, and they point toward the existence of God. And the stronger the evidence, the stronger reason there is to believe that there is a God. So, what kind of evidence are we talking about? Well, there's different kinds. One is simply the existence of the universe. And the arguments, I mean, there's a whole lot of arguments based around this, but they go something like this. Look, things don't just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. Is this causing some problems? Oh, okay. Is it working okay? Okay, that's fine. It seems to me it's caused all over the place. The argument really goes like this. Things like universes don't pop into existence out of nothing, do they? I mean, ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. And you can put the argument in very different ways, but if you say something like this, things which have a beginning must have a cause, right? No matter what it is. If the universe had a beginning, which the standard Big Bang cosmology tells us that it did, well then what do we have to conclude from that? The universe must have had a cause, some kind of cosmic cause big enough to bring something like a universe into play. It's a really interesting line of reasoning, and there's a lot more to it than that. But I was talking with a small group this morning in the class. I remember watching an atheist who kind of acknowledging some of this point, and he on a different matter, and he said this, talking to a group of people, actually in a debate format, and he said, his name is Dr. Kai Nielsen, a really well-known atheist who debates and argues his position a lot, but he conceded this point. He said, if I'm in the room with you here today, and I hear, and we all hear a bang out in the hallway, and you say to me, what caused that bang? And suppose I were to say to you, nothing, it just happened. He said, you would not accept my reply, would you? In fact, you would find my reply quite unintelligible, he says. Well, you know what? I think he's right about that. And the theist who makes the argument from the existence of the universe is saying the same kind of thing here. If it applies to little bangs, it also applies to big bangs as well. If a big bang happened, well, when we say, what caused that big bang? Nothing, it just happened. That is equally unintelligible to the Little Bang. And the arguments go on like that. There's different reasons for believing the universe had a beginning, but that's how they go. And there's more that could be said there on that, but that's one line of argumentation. Another one is the design that is seen in the universe. This is there again. These arguments have been around for hundreds of years and have been critiqued and defended again back and forth by many people. But this argument, in a nutshell, just says this: look at design wherever you find it. Design requires what? Can you finish that for me? Design requires a designer. When you find design of any kind, it requires a designer. Well, guess what? The universe really looks like it exhibits design. And so what can we conclude from that? The universe requires a designer, again, a cosmic designer. What I find the most fascinating thing about this kind of argument is that almost everybody admits there's something like design out there in the universe. I mean, Christians admit it very happily, very happy to admit it. A person like Richard Dawkins, a very well-known scientist, but who's an atheist, he looks at the same thing, and I used to have students read some things by Richard Dawkins, written not his book, The God Delusion, but books he wrote on science, the scientific workings that he saw in the universe and the world, and the way things would work together in very intricate ways. I mean, it was amazing reading how he could bring out details that most of us would never have access to because he was a scientist and he was an expert in these matters. And you'd read this about how bees work together and how what happened in their hives and how the whole thing worked in a marvelous way to make the thing happen. You'd almost think you were reading a Christian talking about the design argument. But then he would get to the end and he's saying, you know what, this looks like design, but it can't be design. Why can't it be design? As far as Richard Dawkins is concerned. The answer is what? There's no designer. So if there's no designer, of course it's not design, so what does he call it? Apparent design. And that's an interesting admission to me. He's seeing the same thing the rest of us see, but it's apparent design because he knows there's no designer up there. Well, the design argument advocate says, no, you can't do that. If it appears to be design, well, then we need to go with that and promote this argument all the way through. It appears to be design. Designer requires a designer. Therefore, there's at least really good reason for believing the universe requires a designer because it too exhibits design. Now, of course, Richard Dawkins says, I think we can explain it without a designer, with a long evolutionary process. But even then, design advocates say, however long it took, the length of time isn't really the big deal here. If there's design still requires a designer. And of course, we're not talking only about biological design now. Now we're talking about cosmic constants and things like that. People who have worked on the design argument recently are saying it's now making a huge comeback, and it's probably the most popular kind of argument being used now by philosophers and scientists as they promote the existence of God. So that's just one other area. The others I'll comment on real quickly. How about moral values that are in the universe? This is the one C.S. Lewis talked about in his book Mere Christianity. He begins by talking about this, and he goes on. The idea is that if there are real objective moral values in the universe, there must be something more than a universe here, because if there was just a universe here, just human beings, and that's all there were, how would they ever spit out objective moral value? We could agree on a certain set of morality, but what would make it objective? And the moral argument says there must be some kind of moral prescriber somewhere behind there. And then it goes back and then further on than that. But then there's others, people who claim to have had direct encounters with God and direct encounters with Jesus, and then, of course, other claims made by Jesus, and etc. These are the kinds of evidence, and these would have to be looked at in great detail, but this is the kind of evidence that is there, that is usually brought forward to prove the existence of God. Now, what is it with atheism? What's involved in proving atheism? Well, in proving atheism, there's actually a built-in difficulty, and I wonder if some of us in this room might know what that is. What's a built-in difficulty involved in proving atheism? It's a really interesting thing. Here's the term. It's a term used by people who write logic textbooks and whatnot. The term is a universal negative, that atheism involves the proving of a universal negative. Technical term, maybe some of us in this room haven't used that term before. It's not a really very difficult term to use. But notice the claim made by atheists. What is the claim? Remember we said that atheists believe there is no God. But can we finish that sentence? There is no God, according to atheism, where? Let's just finish it. Anywhere, in or out of the universe. There is no God anywhere. Can you see the size of that claim? This is a huge claim. It's called a universal negative. And the built-in difficulty here is that virtually everybody knows that the short of having omniscience, none of us could ever prove a universal negative, and none of us could ever know that a universal negative statement could ever be true. C.S. Lewis simply says, atheism involves this huge claim that back behind the things that science observes, behind those things, there is no transcendent being that could from time to time choose to intervene, and somehow we know that. How could you know that? That's the built-in difficulty here. It's usually put something like this. Suppose, you see, it's one thing to prove a negative. Proving a negative can be done. Proving a universal negative, that's a different story. But let's just compare with proving a positive. Suppose I walk into the room here tomorrow evening, just before the evening starts, and I see Valen here, he's here, and I say, Valen, you know what? I think there's a golf ball in this room somewhere. And Valen says, prove that. Well, what do I need to do to prove that? I need to start looking for the golf ball, don't I? And how long do I have to look to make my case for Valen here, who's being quite skeptical of my claim here? How long do I need to look? Until I find it, right? Now, if I find it in 2 minutes, I'm lucky. It doesn't take me very long. If I find it in 8 minutes or whatever, I got to keep on going. But when I find it, my job's done, right? Now, what if I said, hey, Valen, guess what? I do not believe there's any golf balls in this room. In fact, I'm going to go stronger. I believe there are no golf balls in this room. Valen says, come on, prove that. I say, okay, I'm going to get started. What do I got to do now? How much of the room do I need to search to prove there are no golf balls in this room? I got to prove the whole thing. I got to search the whole thing, don't I? What if I search 90% of it? The other 10% is really hard to get to. And I say to Valen, look it, come on. I've done 90% here. Isn't that good enough? Can't we extrapolate from that it's probably not in the other 10% either? What's Valen going to say? What was that statement you made, Chamberlain? What did you say? Let me hear it again. I said, okay. I said there are no golf balls anywhere in this room. Okay. To prove that, what do you got to do? You got to search everywhere in this room. Well, what if I said this? There are no golf balls anywhere in this entire church building. Now I got a quite a bit bigger job, don't I? What if I said there are no golf balls anywhere in the city of Kamloops? I'd have a real big job. Well, here's what the example is in a philosophy article I used to have students read. It said this: there's no gold in China. I got a pretty big job on my hands, don't I? But not anywhere nearly as big as the person who says there's no God anywhere in or out of the universe. How do you go about proving that? Apart from having omniscience, how can anybody know that? That is the built-in difficulty with proving atheism, and I'm not sure people have thought about this, but as much as maybe we ought to, but people in philosophy pretty much know this. If you need to prove a universal negative, then you are really, you're in bad shape. Because it's something that can't be done by humans, and it can't be done by anybody who's not omniscient. Of course, if you end up being omniscient, that's kind of a little bit of a letdown, isn't it? Because you may find out that you were God in the process of trying to prove there was no God. That's kind of a backfiring on you. But let me go just a bit further. Here's the other route that is sometimes taken here. And this is the one that I sometimes say, if I was an atheist, I guess I would take this route. Well, I don't really know what I would do if I was an atheist, but if I was, I would probably take this route. What is that? To find something in the universe which at least allegedly conflicts with the idea that God exists. You see what I'm saying there? If I can find something in the universe that conflicts with God's existence, and I know it's true, then what do I know about the existence of God? If the two really are incompatible ideas. If this one's true, this one has to be what? False. And that's the way. And of course, what's the prime candidate for that? Evil and suffering in the world. And there's another one that's sometimes used as well, the claim that the concept of God is a contradictory concept. This is why the issue of evil and suffering has become so important in discussions about religion, about faith, and about Christianity. Because it pretty much is the one main argument that atheists have to work with. And I will say this: it can be put very powerfully depending on how it's put, because it has intellectual force if it's put well. It also has emotional force, because all of us can feel the wretched pain that comes along with things that happen in our world. And all you need to do is hear a few stories of some heart-rending things that happen. And you begin saying to yourself, what kind of God would allow that? The way I hear this put the most powerfully is when someone will simply say, you know, I think I mentioned this morning, it took 11 hours for that young girl to get away from home and freeze to death. That other young girl went in that frozen lake. This is an actual story I read about some time back. went in that frozen lake to rescue her dog who had fallen through the ice. The dog got out, but the girl didn't, and the mother watched it all. And by the time she ran home and got the paramedics, came back, the girl was pulled out and died the next day. Why would God allow that kind of stuff? And there's so many of these you can bring forward. This is the kind of thing. Now, notice you're not really getting, now we've moved away from a hard and fast argument, but we're asking a very good question that raises a question for people. In order to make a hard and fast argument here, you need to show somehow that evil in the world is incompatible with the existence of God. And if we can get to that later on, we're going to be able to show that that's a very difficult thing to do. In fact, probably impossible to do that. Because all you need is the possibility that there could be a God with some good reason, even just the very possibility of that. And there again, to deny that, you'd have to be omniscient. So it's very hard to get a hard and fast argument for atheism out of evil in the world, but it still raises questions for people because it has not just an intellectual form, but an emotional form as well, which can be very powerful. That is usually the route that atheists go. The other one is simply to argue that they have no burden to prove their case at all, because to go back and claim that they're not the ones making the claim, which is why we said so earlier. It's so important to recognize atheism is making a claim just as important as a claim theist is making. One saying there is a God, the saying there is not a God. Those are both claims to make. So it's important, I think, that we have that clear. Look, our time is gone now. We're going to come back and pick it up right here tomorrow. Going to move into what's involved in proving dogmatic agnosticism. And then you can come up here, Dave, if you'd care to. Sure. And then we'll push on to the notes from there.